We all know legends like Elvis Presley and Johnny Cash, but before them, there was Rose Maddox, a largely forgotten pioneer. She was the lead singer of America's greatest country band in the 1940s and 1950s. With her explosive style and powerful voice, she was playing rock and roll years before the term existed. She was a huge star, a trendsetter. So how did such an influential artist almost disappear from history? Today we explore the story of Rose Maddox and how the musical revolution she helped start left the person who created it behind. To understand the fire that fueled Rose Maddox, you have to understand the dust that she came from. The story doesn't begin under the bright lights of a stage, but in the desperate, windswept poverty of the American Dust Bowl. Rosalia Arbana Maddox was born in 1925 in Boaz, Alabama, into a family of sharecroppers. For them, and for millions like them, the American dream had curdled into a daily nightmare. The land, overworked and exhausted, was giving up. The sky, once a promise of rain and harvest, now only offered a choking, relentless dust that buried fences, smothered livestock, and crept into every corner of their lives. This was a world of profound scarcity, where the future was measured not in years, but in the hope of the next meal. In 1933, with Rose just 7 years old, her father Charlie and her fiercely determined mother Lula made a decision born of pure desperation. They packed what little they owned, gathered Rose and her 4 older brothers, Cal, Fred, Don, and Henry, and abandoned their home. They were not seeking fame or fortune. They were seeking survival. Their destination was a vague, mythical place called California, a promised land they had only heard of in whispers. Their journey was not one of nostalgic Americana. It was a brutal, humbling odyssey. They hitchhiked, walked, and, in a defining act of their story, illegally hopped onto freight trains. Imagine a 7-year-old girl clinging to her mother, huddled with her brothers in a rattling open boxcar, the grinding of steel wheels the only soundtrack to their flight. They were hungry, they were cold, and they were among an army of the dispossessed, all heading west with the same desperate hope. This journey was more than just a trip across the country. It was an education in resilience. It stripped away everything but the core of their being, the fierce, unbreakable bond of family. And in the heart of little Rose, it forged a toughness and a defiance that would one day make her a star. After a grueling journey, the Maddox family finally arrived in Modesto, California, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a collective will to live. But California was no paradise. They were Okies, a derogatory term for the legions of displaced farmers from Oklahoma, Arkansas, and the surrounding states. They were met with suspicion and scorn, seen as a drain on already scarce resources. The family found themselves living in the grim reality of migrant labor camps, working any job they could find, picking fruit and cotton in the scorching fields of the Central Valley for pennies a day. It was a life of back-breaking labor, constant movement, and little hope. But Lula Maddox was not a woman who accepted defeat. She was, by all accounts, the engine of the family, a matriarch with an iron will and a shrewd understanding of what it took to get ahead. She saw that the fields offered only a slow death, and she began to look for another way out. The answer, she realized, was in her children. The boys could all play instruments, Cal on rhythm guitar, Fred on his famously slap-happy upright bass, Don on fiddle, and Henry on mandolin. They had a raw, energetic sound, but they were missing a centerpiece, a voice that could cut through the noise. And Lula knew exactly who that would be. One day she turned to her youngest, 11-year-old Rose and laid down the law. She wasn't asking, she was telling. Rose, you're going to have to learn to sing. For Rose, who was painfully shy and had never sung a note in public, it was a terrifying prospect. But in the Maddox family, Lula's word was gospel. She began to sing, her voice still developing, but already possessing a startling power and a raw, emotional edge that was impossible to ignore. She learned quickly, absorbing the sounds around her, the gospel hymns, the blues tunes of the other field workers, and the hillbilly songs on the radio. Lula had found her secret weapon. In 1937, with the Great Depression still raging, Lula marched her children down to the local radio station, KTRB, in Modesto. She convinced the station owner, a man who saw a bit of his own scrappy spirit in Lula, to give them a 15-minute slot at the crack of dawn. The show was sponsored by a local furniture store, Rice Furniture, who agreed to pay the family a meager $15 a week. There was just one problem. The sponsor stipulated that all the performers had to be over 16. Rose was only 11. Lula, ever the pragmatist, simply looked the sponsor in the eye and lied, claiming Rose was 16. It was a gamble that could have ended their career before it started, but it worked. The career of the Maddox Brothers and Rose officially began. From their very first performances, it was clear they were something different. This wasn't the somber, mournful music of the Carter family or the lonesome yodel of Jimmie Rodgers. This was music born of pure, chaotic energy. It was a wild, untamed mix of country, gospel, swing, and blues, played at a breakneck pace that made it impossible to sit still. Their sound was a direct reflection of their personality, loud, boisterous, and a little bit dangerous. Fred Maddox didn't just play his bass, he attacked it, slapping the strings with a percussive fury that laid a direct foundation for rockabilly. He was also the band's resident comedian, telling off-color jokes and engaging in wild antics on stage. The brothers hollered, joked, and created a joyful racket. And at the center of it all was Rose. The shy little girl was gone. In her place was a pint-sized powerhouse, a vocalist who sang with the force and passion of someone who knew what it felt like to have nothing. Her voice was a clarion call, clear, strong, and imbued with a sassy, almost dangerous sense of confidence. She wasn't just singing the songs, she was living them, channeling all the hardship and hope of her young life into every note. Their radio show became a local sensation. People who had toiled all week in the fields, fellow Dust Bowl refugees, found a release in the Maddox's jubilant noise. It was the sound of survival, of laughing in the face of despair. They were one of them, and their success felt like a victory for the entire community. Lula, now their full-time manager, understood the power of image long before marketing became a buzzword. While other country acts wore drab overalls or simple dresses, Lula decided her family would be a spectacle. She took them to a tailor in Hollywood who had worked with cinema cowboys like Tom Mix and Gene Autry. Lula began dressing them in the most outrageously flamboyant custom-made Western costumes imaginable. They wore matching outfits dripping with sequins, fringe, and intricate embroidery of cacti, wagon wheels, and bucking broncos. The colors were blinding: electric blues, fiery reds, canary yellows. They were a riot of color and sound in a drab gray world. Rose, in particular, was a vision. Lula designed outfits for her that were a world away from the gingham dresses of other female country singers. She wore revealing Hollywood-inspired ensembles, often with bare midriffs, halter tops, and short skirts that showed off her legs. For the deeply conservative world of 1940s country music, this was downright scandalous. They famously billed themselves as the most colorful hillbilly band in America. And it wasn't an exaggeration, it was a simple statement of fact. By the mid-1940s, their fame had spread beyond the Central Valley. They signed a recording contract with Four Star Records, a small independent label that gave them the freedom to be themselves. And it was here that they began to forge a new sound. In 1946, they recorded a song called Rudy Tooty, a frantic high-octane number about a wild night out. Later that year came the song that would truly define their legacy, George's Playhouse Boogie. It was a revelation. With Fred's slap bass driving the rhythm, Don's fiddle playing sounding more like a wild saxophone, and Rose's wild, almost shouted vocals, it was a sound that had no name yet. Years later, people would call it Rockabilly. In that moment, it was just the Maddox sound, loud, fast, and built for dancing. They followed it with another anthem, The Philadelphia Lawyer, a dark, dramatic tale of a cheating wife and a subsequent murder, which Rose sang with a chilling theatrical flair. The song became a massive hit, and it catapulted them to national stardom. They were no longer just a California novelty. They were one of the biggest acts in country music. They became headliners, touring the country in a fleet of Cadillacs, a far cry from the freight trains of their youth. They joined the prestigious Louisiana Hayride radio show, a known stepping stone to the pinnacle of the country music world, the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville. When the Maddox Brothers and Rose arrived in Nashville in the late 1940s, it was like a collision of two separate worlds. Nashville was the heart of the country music establishment, centered around the hallowed stage of the Ryman Auditorium. It was conservative, deeply traditional, and had a very clear idea of what a country star, particularly a female country star, should be. Women were expected to be demure, wholesome, the sweethearts and mothers of the genre, like the beloved Sarah and Maybelle of the Carter family. They were the gentle harmony, not the lead melody. Then came Rose Maddox. She was not demure. She was a firecracker. On stage, she was a whirlwind of energy, stomping her feet, shaking her hips, and belting out songs with a power that could rival any man's. She would growl, yelp, and laugh mid-song, and her outfits, which were a sensation in California, were a source of horror for the Opry management, led by the stern George D. Hay. They saw her flashy, revealing costumes as cheap, gaudy, and deeply inappropriate for the family-friendly show. They constantly tried to police her appearance, demanding she cover up, tone it down, be more of a lady. Rose, who had fought for everything she had and was backed by the equally formidable Lula, refused to buckle. She saw the hypocrisy immediately. Male stars like Webb Pierce and Hank Williams were celebrated for their flamboyant rhinestone-studded nudie suits. But a woman showing that same level of flair was deemed unacceptable. In one legendary backstage confrontation, an Opry official told her that her outfit, likely a halter top and short skirt, was not suitable for the Ryman stage. Rose, never one to mince words, famously retorted, "If you don't like the way I dress, you can just kiss my ass." The clash was about more than just a dress code. It was a cultural war. The Maddoxes represented the wild, untamed West Coast, a new sound, and a new attitude that Nashville wasn't ready for. Rose's very presence was a challenge to the patriarchal order of country music. She was a woman who was unapologetically in charge on stage, who sang about desire, betrayal, and a good time with an authority that was usually reserved for men. The Opry tolerated her because she was a massive draw. The crowds went wild for them, but they never truly accepted her. She was too loud, too flashy, too much of a woman for them to handle. This simmering conflict would shadow the rest of her career, marking her as a permanent outsider in the town that was supposed to be her musical home. Despite the friction with the establishment, the early 1950s were the peak of their success. They were touring relentlessly, playing to sold-out crowds, and their records were consistent bestsellers. They were a well-oiled machine, with Lula managing the finances with an iron fist, and the family delivering an unforgettable show every single night. But beneath the surface of this family triumph, the pressure cooker that had forged them was beginning to crack them apart. For nearly 20 years, the Maddox family had been a single inseparable unit, bound together by poverty and ambition. Rose had been the focal point, the meal ticket since she was a child. The brothers, all talented musicians in their own right, had largely lived in her shadow. As they grew older, got married, and started their own families, the relentless touring, sometimes 300 days a year, and Lula's absolute control began to take a heavy toll. They wanted more autonomy, more of a say in their careers and their finances, which Lula kept under tight lock and key. They wanted to come off the road and be fathers to their children. The tension finally boiled over in 1956. Fred, the wild man on the bass and the comedic heart of the band, decided he'd had enough. He quit. His departure was a devastating blow, and the delicate chemistry of the band was shattered. They tried to replace him, but it was impossible. One by one, the other brothers followed, seeking more stable lives off the road. The most colorful hillbilly band in America, the family that had survived the Dust Bowl and conquered the music world, simply fell apart. For Rose, it was more than the end of a band. It was the end of her world. At 31 years old, the only life she had ever known was gone. She had been performing with her brother since she was a child, and now, for the first time, she was completely on her own. The breakup was deeply acrimonious, filled with hurt feelings and financial disputes that would poison their relationships for years. Rose felt abandoned and betrayed by the very people she had spent her life supporting. In a heartbreakingly candid interview years later, she admitted, "It broke my heart. I cried for a year. I was just lost." The woman who projected an image of unbreakable strength on stage was now facing the terrifying silence of a solo career. Almost immediately, Capitol Records, a major label, saw an opportunity and signed Rose as a solo artist. On paper, it was a step up from the small 4-star label. Capitol was the home of superstars like Frank Sinatra and Nat King Cole. They paired her with Ken Nelson, one of the architects of the smooth, pop-inflected Bakersfield sound. Her first solo album, a collection of Rose Maddox's best, was released in 1957, and she scored a major hit with the song "Sing a Little Song of Heartache." She followed it with other successful singles like "Gambler's Love" and "Kissing My Pillow." It seemed like she was on the verge of a second act, a career even bigger than the one she'd had with her brothers. But the musical landscape was shifting under her feet with seismic force. The raw, wild hillbilly boogie that she had helped pioneer had mutated and exploded into a global phenomenon called rock and roll. Stars like Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Carl Perkins were taking the very energy the Maddoxes had championed and were becoming the biggest names on the planet. Ironically, the revolution Rose had started was now making her sound obsolete to a younger generation who wanted the male version of that rebellion. At the same time, Nashville was moving in the opposite direction. In response to the threat of rock and roll, producers like Chet Atkins and Owen Bradley were creating the Nashville sound. It was a polished, sophisticated style of country music with lush string arrangements, smooth background vocals, and a pop sensibility. Artists like Patsy Cline and Jim Reeves were having massive crossover hits with this new sound. It was the antithesis of everything Rose Maddox stood for. Her music was raw, not refined. It was about grit, not gloss. Capitol Records and Ken Nelson tried to push her in this smoother direction, but it was like trying to tame a hurricane. Her voice was too powerful, her style too gritty to be coated in strings and sugar. She was caught in a cultural crossfire. She was too country for the rock and rollers and too rock and roll for the new slick Nashville. Her career began to stall. She continued to record for Capitol until the mid-60s, but the hits became harder to come by. She was a frequent guest on television shows and continued to tour, a beloved figure to her loyal fans. But the momentum was gone. The industry that she had helped to build was now politely but firmly showing her the door. By the early 1960s, the woman who had once been a queen of country music was fading from the national spotlight. Her disappearance wasn't a sudden event, but a slow, painful erosion. She hadn't changed. The world had. And though she faded from the mainstream in the 1960s, her story didn't end there. In a stunning third chapter, Rose was rediscovered in the late 70s and 80s. As the roots and bluegrass revivals spread, musicians and fans began to look for authentic voices from the past. And they found Rose Maddox. She began performing again, this time with highly regarded bluegrass bands. She was embraced by a younger generation of audiences who saw her not as a relic, but as the godmother of punk rock, an icon of rebellion and authenticity. This belated resurgence was a sweet vindication. She recorded a series of critically acclaimed albums, including the aptly titled $35 and A Dream in 1994, which earned her a Grammy nomination. The name was a poignant reminder of how little money her family had when they arrived in California. She had come full circle. Rose Maddox continued to tour until near the end of her life. After years of battling heart disease, she died quietly on April 15, 1998, in Ashland, Oregon, at the age of 72. Her death did not create the media sensation that other major stars do. There was no television special, no big headlines. It was a peaceful departure from a stormy life, far from the hustle and bustle of an industry that had celebrated and then forgotten her. Yet among the devoted fans of West Coast country, bluegrass, and rockabilly, her passing was a devastating loss. Critics and music historians wrote retrospectives that reaffirmed her pioneering role. They expressed not just grief, but also a quiet outrage at the neglect she endured. Rose Maddox's legacy lies not in the awards she won, but in the sound she created. It lies in the pounding bass line that birthed rockabilly. It lies in the defiant attitude that paved the way for every female artist who refused to be just a pretty girl. And it lies in the resilience of a girl who survived a dust storm to turn pain into joy. Rose Maddox's story is a reminder that history has not always been fair to pioneers. Her name may have faded, but her sound, a blend of chaos and joy, lives on in every beat of rock and roll. It's time we remember her, not as a forgotten star, but as one of its greatest creators.